questions is that when you're dealing with definitions of words, which we have to in these introductory textbooks, you might be a little unsure as to exactly what is being meant. So, yeah, if you have a specific question for us about a specific question, feel free to ask, or, you know, if you don't have it with you, you can always email. Yeah?
I got this one wrong, and it was like,
How do you know?
because you turned it in and it told me that it was wrong.
Okay, well, it shouldn't do that, and I've set it so that it won't do that. It'll just tell you your score.
Yeah, and it said 0 out of 1, so like, that's how I know I got it wrong.
You only answered one question?
No. Like, I got 36 out of 40, but it told me like which 3 questions.
Okay, well, it shouldn't do that, and like, did you,
Yeah, like,
did it just tell you your score, or?
it tells you your score and then it shows you if you got a certain question right or wrong, but it doesn't show anything else.
It shouldn't even do that, but anyway, so ask the question.
Okay, so it says Michigan is beautiful and Michigan is not ugly.
Right.
And I said that it had the same meaning, but different connotation.
Yeah. Now remember, the test for meaning is if one could be true while the other is false, it means something different, right? And not just connotation. Connotation is they can both have the same truth conditions, but one is disrespectful and one isn't, like geezer and elderly gentleman. Okay, well in that one, can you think of a circumstance where it would be true to say that something is not ugly without it implying that they're beautiful?
It's a really flat plain works for me.
Yeah, like a field, just a boring field. You know, not even a particularly good field. You could say, well, it's not ugly, but are you saying that it's beautiful? No, there's the middle ground of meh, right? So, not ugly includes all of beautiful, but more as well. And it's the more as well that makes the difference. Okay?
And then are we not using like connotation, like the feelings associated with the word?
Well, usually that only comes up if they're different. I'm sorry, if they're the same in meaning, right? Because if they're different in meaning, then you know the issue of whether or not they're different in connotation is like I don't know. Is there a difference in connotation between so and so is a flaming asshole and somebody else is a nice guy? Well, they don't even mean the same, so the connotation issue doesn't arise. That example sticks in my head because one of my first professors in graduate school used that example as an illustration of something that shouldn't ever be thought of literally. And so consequently, 20 years later, it's still there. Okay, any other questions? No? Good, don't forget, when is the deadline for your homework?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock? Tuesday, all right. But you're all going to do it immediately after this class, aren't you? Yes, of course you are. But before you do, although some intrepid people have surged ahead anyway, there are some questions on the homework that we didn't cover previously, so I'll talk about that now. That is to do with relative clauses. Relative clauses. Okay, last time we talked, I gave you some examples of amphiboly. What was amphiboly? Sentences that are just as comfortable on the land and in the water. What's that?
When sentences can mean two things.
Yes, when sentence, so it's ambiguity of sentences. Ambiguity, words can be ambiguous depending on the context. You don't know whether, like for example, teacher strikes idle kids. There, strikes is ambiguous. The word itself is ambiguous, and that of course contributes to the ambiguity of the whole sentence. Is strikes a noun, as it's intended to be, or is it a verb, which is the humorous interpretation? Okay, so words can be ambiguous, but sentences as well can be ambiguous, and when that happens we call it amphiboly. Now, that can be funny, right? As in the examples I gave last time. You know, judges to try shooting defendant, juvenile court to try shooting defendant, or, you know, patient at death's door, doctors pulling through. Those are funny. They're funny because of the two possible meanings. But unless you're trying to be funny, it's often a very bad thing if your sentence could mean either of two things. There are two possible solutions for this. One possible solution is to replace natural languages, of which English is an example, with the language of logical notation. Because one of the advantages of logical notation, which you will know by the end of this class, is that it's never ambiguous. It can only ever mean one thing. Which is why if somebody is not seeing the ambiguity of their sentence, sometimes philosophers say, well, it could mean this or it could mean this, and give two different logical notations, because they only can mean one thing. But of course, most people, sadly, education being the way it is, do not know logical notation. So the better solution is just to rewrite your sentence, because there is always a non-ambiguous way of writing an ambiguous sentence. And often the difference is in punctuation. And this is an important point worth making. I think a lot of people regard punctuation, you know, commas and that kind of thing, as just a sort of seasoning that you sprinkle on your sentence after the fact that doesn't affect its meaning. It's the words that mean things, you think. The commas are just where somebody needs to take a breath if they're reading it. Well, no. Turns out that punctuation alone can affect the meaning of a sentence. So same words, different punctuation, you can get different meanings. And one clear example of this is what we're going to talk about now, which is relative clauses. Okay, let me erase the punctuation first of all. I'm using as an example, they talk about Japanese eating a lot of fish. I'm just going to use this example. So here's an example of a sentence containing a relative clause. Americans who eat a lot of burgers have more heart disease. Okay. Now, that itself is a sentence. All sentences have what two features, as you learned very early on in grammar? Maybe from your grammar. What's that?
Subject.
Noun and verb, well, true, but subject and
Predicate.
predicates, yes. So grammarians divide sentences crudely into subject. What is the subject of a sentence?
The thing that is doing.
Or the thing that the sentence is about.
Yeah.
Yes, the thing that the sentence is about. And then the predicate is making a claim about the subject. So every proposition, of course, must have this structure. Because remember, what is the key feature of all propositions? The number one most important feature? They have
Truth value.
truth value, that's right. So a proposition can be either true or false, and the only way to be saying something true or false is to be saying something about something. So if I just say goldfish, that's not a proposition, because it isn't saying something about goldfish. It can be neither true or false. So all sentences that express a proposition have a subject and predicate. Now, clauses also have subject and predicate. So sentences are examples of clauses, but some clauses can exist within the context of a larger sentence and can only exist there. They can't be standalone sentences. And such clauses are, examples of such clauses are relative clauses. So a relative clause is a clause that makes sense, that has a subject and something being said about the subject, but only makes sense in a larger context. Because the word that stands for the subject of a relative clause itself, you only know what it refers to because of the context it's in. And here's one other thing about relative clauses. If you remove a relative clause from the sentence that contains it, what is left is a sentence that makes sense. Okay? So, with those clues in mind, what is the relative clause in this sentence?
Who eat a lot of burgers?
Who eat a lot of burgers? That's right. This is the relative clause. Because notice if you remove that, you're left with a miserable sentence. Americans have more heart disease. Okay? So, that's the relative clause. And why is it a relative clause? What is the word that stands in for the subject of this sentence?
Who?
Who. Now that is a word whose meaning is relative to the context it's in. Who doesn't refer to anything by itself. You only know what the who refers to when it follows Americans. Okay? So that's the relative clause in that sentence. Alright. Now, a sentence with exactly these words in exactly this order could mean one of two things. Here are the two options. One, all Americans, it could be a statement that says two things about all Americans. First, all Americans eat a lot of burgers, and all Americans have more heart disease, presumably more heart disease than non-Americans. Okay, so that's one possible reading. The other, different reading, different meaning, is not all Americans, but a subset of Americans eat a lot of burgers, and that subset of Americans has more heart disease, presumably, than other Americans. So, the first one is all Americans both eat a lot of burgers and have more heart disease than non-Americans. Or the second possibility is a subset of Americans, some Americans, eat a lot of burgers, and those Americans have more heart disease than the others. Do you see the difference between the two possibilities? As it's written, which one is the correct interpretation of this sentence? One or two?
Two.
Who says two? Why? It just is, right? You can just tell because you know English.
Americans who eat a lot of burgers is the entire subject.
So you could say the way it's written, it's like Americans who eat a lot of burgers have more heart attacks. Okay. Now, I can recognize you with your hair flowing free.
Oh my goodness,
So the relative clause there, well, these two possibilities represent the meaning of the sentence in the two alternative kinds of relative clause. So, this is the relative clause, and it could be one of two kinds of relative clause. The relative clauses are restrictive or non-restrictive. Now, if the relative clause is restrictive, it would be the second meaning, and you can see why it would be restrictive. Because the second meaning is restricting the scope to a subset of Americans. It's not talking about all Americans, it's restricting the discussion to just the Americans that eat a lot of burgers. Whereas the first meaning is talking about all Americans. It's not restricting it, it's non-restrictive. Okay? So, relative clauses come in two types, non-restrictive or restrictive. This is the relative clause. If this relative clause were non-restrictive, then this sentence would be talking about all Americans. If this relative clause is restrictive, then it would just be talking about some Americans. You've decided, in your infinite wisdom, that this relative clause is what type? Restrictive, and you are correct. This is an example of a restrictive relative clause. How do I turn it into a non-restrictive one so that it means the first one?
Do it on a comma.
Not just one comma.
In front of who and then behind burger.
Yes, so two commas. Commas both before and after the relative clause. So that's why we've tied it into what I was saying about punctuation. The only difference between a restrictive clause and a non-restrictive one is the comma. Here's the commas. And in fact, that's how you can remember this if you're struggling. Non-restrictive, comma, both have O's in them. If that helps, well good. If it doesn't, forget I said it. Okay, So now, notice the difference. Americans, how many Americans? All of them. Americans who eat a lot of burgers, all Americans eat a lot of burgers, and all Americans have more heart disease. That's what that says. Make sense?
So the
Okay.
comma makes it non-restrictive?
What's that?
The comma makes it non-restrictive.
Right, the comma makes it non-restrictive because now we're talking about all Americans. Whereas before, when we sort of ran on, our subject was Americans who eat a lot of burgers, and we're only talking about those. Whereas the comma stops us, and we're talking about just Americans. Okay? All right, let's see if we can tell the difference in more examples. Turn to, in the textbook that you now all own, turn to page 75. I'm going to start at random with Chris at the back there. Could you read number 1, please?
People who live in a glass house shouldn't throw stones.
Yes, good advice. What is the relative clause in that sentence?
Who live in glass house?
Yes, who live in glass houses, that's right. So notice that once again you can tell it's relative clause because if you removed the whole thing you'd be left with a meaningful sentence. It would just say people shouldn't throw stones, which is true. Okay, so that's the relative clause, who live in glass houses. Is it restrictive or non-restrictive?
It is restrictive.
It is restrictive. So how many people shouldn't throw stones?
All people living in house.
Well, all people or just people who live in glass houses? Just the people who live in glass houses. So it's restricted. We're just talking about that. Okay, good. Number 2, Jamie.
What page are we on again?
Page 75.
Okay. I love jewels that are expensive.
Okay. What is the relative clause? I can tell by your diamond encrusted grill. What is the relative clause?
Love jewels.
Anyone?
That are expensive.
That are expensive. Remember, because if you took that away, you were left with I love jewels, which makes sense. Okay, so now, is it restrictive or non-restrictive? Restrictive. Notice what's not there. What's not there?
Commas.
Commas. So if there was a comma, it would be non-restrictive, so there isn't a comma, so it's restrictive. So how many jewels do you love? All of them? Only the expensive ones, because we're restricting it. Okay, the scope of your love is limited. You don't go for that costume jewelry. All right, number 3, Hunter.
I love diamonds, which are expensive. Relative clauses, which are expensive, and it's non-restrictive.
So that means how many diamonds do you love?
Diamonds that are expensive.
Well, which is? All of them. So in other words, because it's non-restrictive, we're saying 2 things about all diamonds. You love them, and they are all expensive. Now, apart from the comma and the switching of diamonds for jewels, what is the difference between 2 and 3?
That and which.
That and which, and that is a grammar rule of American English. It's not even a grammar rule of English, the true English. The grammar rule is this. If you have a comma, you use which. If you don't have a comma, you use that. Why? I don't know, it's a grammar rule. They're all arbitrary, but it is a rule. So if you want to look smart, follow that rule. If you have a comma, you need a which. And so in other words, if you have the word which, that's a clue that it's a non-restrictive relative clause, where if it starts with the word that, it's going to be a restrictive relative clause. Number 4, Brandon.
Wars that are waged in self-defense are justified. It is restrictive.
Restrictive. So how many wars are justified?
Ones that are waged in self-defense.
Are all wars waged in self-defense according to this?
No.
No. Good. Number 5, Brandy.
The driver behind me who has his brights on is a pain in the neck.
Notice they said neck, they were being polite. What is the relative clause?
Who has his brights on?
What is the difference between this example and all the other ones we've done? Well, that's happened in this case, for example.
It's talking about someone like behind him.
That's, yeah, I wasn't thinking that specific. Yeah,
Rather than defining a set, it chooses a particular individual.
that's right. We're just talking about one person here. All the other ones before, wars, people, jewels, Americans, have all been groups of things. So you can see how it could be restrictive or non-restrictive. You can talk about all of the group, or you can just talk about part of the group. How does it work when there's only one person? Are we just, if it was restrictive, would it just be talking about his foot or something? What's the difference between restrictive and non-restrictive in cases where we're only talking about one person?
In this case, the restrictive clause defines a set that contains only one member.
Well, true. So what would be the difference in meaning between restrictive and non-restrictive? Are you saying there would be none?
The restrictive seems to me to act as a piece of differential. You take the drivers who are behind me, and then you limit that with the one who has his lights on.
So in other words, with the restrictive, how many drivers could there be behind you?
I have no idea how many there are behind
But
me.
more than one. Right, so you don't know. Whereas if it's non-restrictive, how many drivers are behind you? One. So if it's non-restrictive, as it is in this case, oh, I gave it away. The driver behind me, comma, who has his brights on, comma, is a pain in the neck. There's just one driver behind me, and two things are true of him. He's got his brights on and he's a pain in the neck. Whereas if it was the driver behind me who has his brights on is a pain in the neck, there's only one driver behind you who has his brights on, and is therefore a pain in the neck. But how many drivers are there behind you?
More than
Maybe many, right? So that would be the difference. When it's non-restrictive, you know there's only one driver behind you, behind the person talking. Whereas if it was restrictive, you know that there's only one with his brights on, but there could be many drivers. All right? Let's try another one like that. Number 8. Zena.
My accountant, who's very good, does not do his own taxes.
What's the relative clause?
Who's very good, the relative clause, and it's not restrictive.
Right. So according to the way it's written here, how many accountants do you have? One. If we removed the commas, how many accountants possibly would you have?
When I counted what I'm talking about, the one who's very good.
Right. You would have plenty of crap accountants, but just one good one. Fire all. Why have you got so many? Just fire all except the good one. All right. Do we get the basic idea? Okay. Let's move on to chapter 5. Now you know everything you need to know for the homework, or at least maybe you knew it already, but now we've covered in class. So, chapter 5 is about arguments. Now, if there is one thing philosophy, that is the subject matter of philosophy, it is arguments. Now, not arguments, as I've said before, not arguments in the sense of disagreements, where things are thrown and harsh words are exchanged. Arguments in philosophy are like, you would talk about presenting an argument or making a case. I always use as examples the kind of arguments presented in a courtroom. Partly because I think that's one of the areas in modern life where it's so obvious that the argument is important and people take arguments seriously and do not think. Here's one of the big differences between philosophy and, say, other disciplines. In other disciplines, the style of presenting something, or what is called rhetoric, may be important. Who knows what rhetoric means? What does rhetoric mean, Tiz?
Something that you want to convey, the manner in which you choose to present.
Now, what's the point of rhetoric?
To get someone to think your way about something.
Right, so it's the kind of thing like if you're in a debating competition, it helps to be good at rhetoric. Philosophers hate rhetoric with an abiding passion. Rhetoric is evil. Why? Because the point of rhetoric, ideal rhetoric, is when the weaker argument wins. Because you overcame the weakness of your argument with the sheer silveriness of your language, with the suaveness of your presentation. Whereas philosophers are nerds who hate successful people. No, that's a false generalization. But we're kind of old-fashioned. We think there might be a truth about things, and we kind of care at reaching the truth. And I think the case where most people are in agreement about this is in a court of law. You want the truth to win, don't you, in general, particularly if you're on the receiving end. Well, maybe if you're on the receiving end and you're guilty, you don't want the truth to win, but you should lose. So that's why I often use examples, because that's a case where people take seriously, no, we want to get at the truth. We don't just want to win for the sake of it. Politicians want to win for the sake of it. That's why they're interested in connotation. Advertisers want you to buy their product even if it's crap. So they want you to have warmer feelings for it even if they're undeserved. Whereas philosophy, we care about a good argument, and a good argument is supposed to be, whether or not an argument is good is irrelevant. What is irrelevant to it is how beautiful the person is giving the argument, or how nice sounding the words are. Okay, so arguments. What is an argument? I will give you a working definition that we will tinker with over the course of the semester. But a good starting point. An argument, in the sense that we're interested in, is a conclusion supported by at least one premise, and usually more. A one premise argument is rarely a good argument. You can have them, but it's rare. Okay, now that definition is not actually a very good one, as stated. For one thing, I'm defining argument, and I'm using in my definition terms that you're less likely to know than argument, such as premises and conclusion. But I'm going to expand on it. I just want to give you something that is true that we can then work on. I'm going to put capitals too, because it's a technical term. All right, so the first thing we need to know is what these are, conclusions and premises. And one thing that we can state for sure is that they're propositions. So there's been a point to learning about propositions because they are the building blocks of arguments. So a premise is a proposition, a conclusion is a proposition. How do you tell whether something is a conclusion or it's a premise, or it's neither? Is there something intrinsic to the proposition that makes it a premise or a conclusion? So I can just give you one out of context and you will know, oh, that's a premise. The answer is no. So, in other words, the same proposition could be, in one context, a conclusion, in another context, a premise, and in another context, neither. Let me give you an example. Suppose I say, I saw a guy who had giant sideburns and was wearing a velvet, a shiny jumpsuit, and looked just like Elvis would at this age, working at a gas station on Corona Road. Therefore, Elvis is alive. Okay, that is a bad argument. Now, one thing I should say. Today, we're not going to evaluate strength of argument. There are good arguments and there are bad arguments, and we will get into how to tell how strong an argument is later on. But for today, we're just going to talk about whether or not something is an argument, and we'll talk a little bit about the structure of an argument. So that would be an argument. What would be the conclusion of the argument I just gave? Elvis is alive. Okay, so there, Elvis is alive is a conclusion. All right, here's another example. Elvis is alive. I spoke to him the other day, and he said he'd been hanging out with Tupac. Conclusion, Tupac is alive. Okay? Notice, what's the conclusion there?
Tupac is still alive.
Tupac is alive. But notice, I used Elvis is alive in that argument. But in that argument, Elvis is alive was a premise, right? It was used as evidence to support something else. And if I just stood here and said, Elvis is alive, right? It wouldn't be an argument. Some people seem to think that if you yell something, it constitutes an argument, but it doesn't. That would just be a claim. So I used the same proposition, Elvis is alive, as a conclusion, as a premise, as neither. What makes the difference is the context that the proposition occurs in. Okay? So recognizing when the context constitutes an argument is an important talent. Let's see if we have it. Turn to page 93. Notice there's one other word that definitely needs explicating in that definition. What is the one other word? Supported. What does that mean? What is this relationship of support? It's obviously not one in terms of physically holding. We need to explain what that is. And we'll actually spend a lot of the course talking about different ways that that works in logic. But for now, we'll just go on an intuitive idea of it. Who did we reach? We reached you, Jacob.
Want me to read one?
I do.
Cable television can provide the viewer with more channels than broadcast television, and it usually delivers a higher quality picture. For these reasons, the number of cable subscribers will probably continue to grow rapidly.
Yeah, I'm sorry about this book. One of the reasons I wanted to change to the more recent edition is these examples are so freaking old. Maybe if you replaced it with like fiber optics or something, it would be a little more up to date. But yeah, this is a set of propositions. The question at issue is whether or not it's the particular kind of set of propositions that constitutes an argument, or it isn't. It's just a set of propositions. What do you think? Argument, yay or nay?
I'd say it's a pretty good argument.
Well, hold on. If it is an argument, it will have a conclusion. Yes, every argument has one and only one conclusion. The number of premises can vary, but there is always only one conclusion, the point of the argument. The conclusion of an argument is the point of it. If you have more than one conclusion, you've got more than one argument. All right, so what's the conclusion? If this is an argument, what's the conclusion?
The number of cable subscribers will probably continue to grow rapidly.
Who agrees? Why is that a conclusion in this case? How do you know that that's an argument and this is a conclusion?
For these reasons.
For these reasons. So what?
That kind of tells you that what's coming after that is
The point.
Yeah.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yes. So in other words, there is a giveaway in this cluster of propositions, and it's the phrase "for these reasons." So in other words, what that means is what I've said before was reasons for what I'm about to say. So what comes before the "for these reasons" is the premises. What comes after is the conclusion. So "for these reasons" is what we call an indicator phrase for a conclusion. What are some other indicators for a conclusion? Therefore. Therefore is infallible. Therefore is always going to be an indicator word for the conclusion. That's its job. Therefore it doesn't have to do much in language. It just has to it just has to indicate that a conclusion is coming. Philosophers love the word therefore. We use it all the time because we do arguments all the time. But we have to admit it does sound kind of pompous. But we don't. Any others?
As a result.
As a result, yes. Now that's an example where it's made up of words that can be used perfectly well for other purposes, unlike therefore, but when you put them together, it seems to show that a conclusion is followed. With one caveat, which I'll get to when we're talking about another word. Any others? In conclusion, yeah, that one's pretty much of a giveaway. In conclusion is an indicator for what? Oh, a conclusion. Yeah, cut to the chase. If you look on page 90, there's a little box that lists them. So, that conclusion indicators therefore, thus, so, consequently, as a result, it follows that hence, another pompous one, hence, which means that, which implies that. All right, those are all good giveaways that tell you that you've got an argument and what follows it is the conclusion. There's also indicator words for premises. If I say because, then what follows the because is a reason for something else. So if I say Elvis alive because I saw him walking around, then I saw him walking around is the premise for the thing that came before the because. Now, there is some words are infallible indicators, like therefore. Other words are not infallible, and because is an example of these. Because actually has different roles in language. The two most important are, one as an indicator of a premise, but two as to be used in an explanation. And an explanation is not the same as an argument. I will give you an example to try and illustrate the difference. Suppose I were to say this. Michael Jackson is dead because of a drug overdose, or whatever it was. Prescription drugs. That's one. It's that song again, what is it? That's The Cure, isn't it?
It is.
Alright, yeah, I got it. But don't let that happen again.
I'm sorry.
Unless it's Love Cats, because I prefer that.
Oh, I'll have to get that one right.
So, Michael Jackson is dead because of a heart attack. Michael Jackson is dead because he hasn't breathed in 3 years. Now, those are two different examples. One of them is an explanation, and the other one is an argument. Which is which?
Michael Jackson's
What's that?
Michael Jackson's dead would be what he's trying to prove.
Well, it would be in the argument, but there would be no conclusion in the explanation. Well, all right, to help you answer the question, let's talk about the purpose of an argument. Why do they have arguments in courtrooms?
To prove something.
Why do you need to prove something? I mean, for example, if you were to ask me what the time was and I was to tell you, you wouldn't say prove it. So why do you need, I hope not, very distrustful of you. Why do you need to do it in a courtroom?
Some type of reasonable doubt.
He said scornfully. You won't be scornful of that if you're on the wrong end. Yeah, well, why do both sides need to prove it?
To prove their side.
Because there's a disagreement, right? Because in other words, so you give an argument, the conclusion of arguments, there's a point to proving it because the conclusion is in question or controversial. That's when you give arguments, when the conclusion is something surprising. You know, like we don't have to give arguments proving that the earth is round anymore. You know, that's pretty much accepted. But things like, you know, we have arguments about whether or not abortion should be legal, whether or not cloning should be legal, about controversial matters. That's when arguments are important. So, remember, the point of an argument, whatever you're trying to do with an argument is prove that the conclusion is true where there might be some doubt about it. So with that in mind, think of my two examples. Michael Jackson is dead because of a heart attack, or whatever it was, and Michael Jackson is dead because he hasn't breathed in 3 years. Which of them is the argument? The second one. Because the second one attempts to prove that Michael Jackson is dead. What does the first one try to do?
Explain why he's dead.
Explain why. So in other words, we all agree that he's dead, Now we want some further information. How did it happen? So in that case, the Michael Jackson is dead is not controversial. We want further information about it. So it's only in the second case that it works like an argument, that it is demanded that you prove that it is true that Michael Jackson is dead. And then the fact that he hasn't breathed in 3 years is pretty relevant, unless he's a very heavy sleeper. Okay. In which case, it's sad that they buried him. He's trying to moonwalk his way out as we say. Okay, so you can tell that the word because occurred in both of them, but in one case it wasn't an indicator word for a premise. Usually it is, but just so you know. And like as can be used as an indicator word for a premise, but it can also be used, he was as big as a house, right? There the word as is not being used as an indicator word for a premise. But whereas if you see the word therefore, you're home and dry. That's an argument, and what follows it is the conclusion. All right, let's do another one of these fascinating examples. Number 2, we did Jacob. Cat.
The first cable company served remote rural communities. These communities were too far from any broadcast stations to receive a clear signal over the air. Tall towers, usually located on hills, picked up the signals and distributed them to individual homes.
See, I did not know that. I always associate cable with cities, but remote rural, it's fascinating stuff. I'm sure you'll agree. Is it an argument?
No.
Why do you say that?
Because it's not really arguing any facts, and it doesn't really have a conclusion. It's just kind of stating something.
It's just a bunch of facts. They're not related in the right way. So the structure is what makes it an argument. If some of the propositions are intended to support the, one of the others, then it's an argument. That doesn't happen here. So you're right, that's not an argument. Number 3, Karen.
Since cable companies are now serving suburbs and cities, they pose a competitive challenge to broadcast television. I'd say it's an argument because it has a premise and conclusion.
What is the conclusion?
That they pose a competitive challenge to broadcast television.
Yes. Now, later on, what I'm going to have you do, like next class, is I'm going to give you passages like this. And I'm going to ask you, first of all, to list all of the propositions, number them, and then diagram them. And we'll learn about diagramming. You better not be cracking your knuckles back there. You'll learn about diagramming in the latter half of this class. When we do that, I want you, when you list each of the propositions, to list them as if they were standalone sentences. So remember, the trouble with a relative clause is it includes words like this, whose meaning depends on the context. So if I just gave you this by itself, you wouldn't know what the who refers to. And that can actually sometimes happen with propositions that you're given. So for example, you said, they pose a competitive challenge. If you were just listing the conclusion, what should you say instead of that?
Cable companies.
Right. So it's just something I'm going to demand that you do, so it's good to get used to it. Jet. So that one was an argument, you're right. Number 4, Jet.
More than half the homes in the country subscribe to cable television. Basic cable service usually includes local TV channels such as
the 3 networks. That hasn't been true for like 20 years.
And 1 or more news channels. For an additional fee, subscribers can also receive movie channels and other specialized programs.
Mm. And then ignore them because everybody just watches the internet. Is that an argument?
Doesn't really seem like one.
Because?
I just feel like it's like you're looking at like a little guide, like a brochure or something to like switch to it.
Right, so it's not making a single particular point. Yeah, I am bored of this already, but you get the basic idea. These examples are so tedious, it's impossible to stay on them for long. But you get the difference. Sometimes you have an argument, sometimes you don't. Basically, from now on, we will be looking at examples of arguments. So we will kind of assume that we've got an argument. But you need to be able to tell if you're presented with a passage whether or not it's an argument. Yes?
So if it's not an argument, you don't call the propositions
Premises or conclusions. They're still propositions because they can be either true or false, but they're not premises or conclusions. If you don't have an argument, you don't have premises and a conclusion. So an argument is composed of premises and conclusions, but it sort of works the other way as well. If you don't have an argument, then you don't have premises. What is a premise? Something that works in an argument to support the conclusion. So no argument, no premises, and vice versa. Okay? All right. Now, the next step we're going to talk about is, well, we've already seen that this is what an argument is. It's a conclusion supported by one or more premises. What do we mean by support? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to learn how to illustrate the logical structure of an argument. Because arguments have logical structure, that's what makes them arguments, the way in which the propositions relate to each other. But they can have different logical structures depending on which proposition is supposed to support which. And you can reveal this logical structure using the diagramming method that we're now going to learn. Okay. Let's go on to the next set of exercises on page 96. 96. If you go to 100, you've gone 4 pages too far. All right. Now, here we have an example of an argument. Could you read it, Josh?
To be a lawyer, you need to be good at keeping track of details, and Lonnie is terrible at that, so he shouldn't go into law.
Now, how many propositions are there?
2.
Look at the numbers. 3, yes, they kind of told you that there are 3. Now notice that there's only one sentence, so this is an example of how a single sentence can contain more than one proposition. This one's got 3. And furthermore, it asserts 3 propositions. When we list the propositions in an argument, we're only listing the ones that are asserted. Remember that distinction? When does a sentence assert a proposition?
When that proposition is meant to be taken as true.
Yes. So for example, you can find a proposition within a sentence, which means that it's expressed. If you can find it, it's expressed. But not all expressed propositions are asserted. If there's only one proposition, then it will be asserted. In short sentences, it's always the case that the entire sentence is asserted. But sometimes you'll have longer sentences that express more than one proposition, and sometimes they can not be asserted. What's an example of when you have expressed but not asserted?
If I travel to New York, I meet my friends.
That would be an if-then, yes. So if you say, if I travel to New York, then I'll meet my friends. That contains I travel to New York, because that could be true or false. And I meet my friends, that could be true or false. So they're both propositions, so there are 2 propositions there, and they're obviously expressed, because if they're there, they're expressed. But are they asserted? In other words, if it's true that if I travel to New York, then I will meet my friends, is it true that I'm traveling to New York right now? No. So that would be an example of expressed, because it's there, but not asserted. The whole thing is actually itself a proposition. So propositions are a bit like numbers. How many numbers are here? 2. But actually, this constitutes another number. What's the other number? 6. Good. You're on top of it. Yes. So the whole thing is a number. 6. Same with propositions. So you say, if P, then Q, you have 2 propositions there, but this whole thing is also a proposition. How do we know? Because it could be true or false. Is it true that if I travel to New York, then I'll meet my friends? Well, not if you don't have any friends in New York, right? So the whole thing can be true, and in fact, the whole thing is always asserted. In the whole sentence, the proposition representing the whole sentence is always asserted. But the component parts are sometimes only expressed. And that happens when you use if-then, and what else? Or. The conjunction or, that's another. But if you use the conjunction and, they're also asserted. Remember that? You better, because you got it on your homework. All right. So if you came across, so for diagramming purposes, suppose you had, I don't know, each letter represents a proposition. how many propositions, if you were listing the propositions that are asserted in this argument, how many would you list? No. No. 2. Because I said you have to list the propositions that are asserted. Is this asserted? Is this asserted?
No.
This is asserted because it's the only one, and this whole thing is also asserted. So if you listed the propositions, you would list this and this. However, now how many propositions are asserted?
2.
How many?
3.
3. 1, 2, 3. Okay? So if you were if I asked you to go through an argument and list all the propositions, you would list 1, 2, 3. Whereas before, if you had this, it would just be 1, 2. Okay? It'll become more clear next time when I ask you to do that. But anyway, here they've been nice and they've numbered the propositions. So we don't even have to work out how many there are. It's done for us. There are 3. All right. If you were to list them, again, I would require you to write them out in full. So, I would require you, but I'm not going to do it because I'm lazy, to be a lawyer, but I will illustrate what you should. To be a lawyer, you need to be good at keeping track of details. What would the next proposition be?
Lonnie's terrible at keeping good track of details.
Yes, you can't say Lonnie is terrible at that, because the word that, what it means depends on the context. You have to write it so it's context independent. So Lonnie is terrible at keeping track of details. And then what would the last one be? Lonnie shouldn't go into law. Yes. You can't use the word he because that's another one of those words whose reference depends on its context. Okay, those are our 3 propositions. This is an argument. One of them will be the conclusion. Which one? Everybody.
3.
Everybody.
3.
Yes, that's right. How can you tell?
So.
It has the word so, which is an indicator word for the conclusion. But even if the word so wasn't there, how could you tell?
Because the other 2 support them.
Yeah, it's clearly the point. The point. What's the point of this thing? Well, it's to show that Lonnie shouldn't go into law. All right. Now we're going to learn how to diagram this argument. When you're diagramming an argument, the first stage is to go through and number all the propositions in the list. Here they've given you the numbers, but just to give you a hint of what horrors lie ahead, have a look at pages 120, 121. 120, 121. There you have passages full of propositions. They're passages actually taken from actually written things by actual people. And they contain arguments that you would have to go through and sort out the propositions, how many propositions there are, they're asserted. You would also have to, if they repeat the same proposition, you only count it once. And that often happens. So for example, yeah, actually that reminds me of something I figured out, something freaking obvious that I figured out the first time in 20 years. We sometimes use the word conclusion to mean what?
Summary of everything you just said.
Or the end of something. Like when my journey reaches its conclusion. Do not assume that the conclusion is always at the end of an argument. It's the point of an argument, but it's not always at the end. You can have the conclusion at the beginning. So for example, if you're on trial and the prosecution comes forward, the prosecution might say, this person here is guilty of this heinous crime, as I shall now prove. So that's the conclusion. The point is that you're guilty. But she says it right at the beginning. And then she'll probably say it several times just to hammer home the point for the conclusion, for the jury. But, you know, the conclusion is not always at the end. Of course it is here, but not always. All right, so the conclusion is Lonnie shouldn't go into law. Now, how do diagrams work? Well, there are three simple elements to a diagram. First of all, numbers. In this case, 1, 2, and 3. Secondly, arrows. And thirdly, and this is not in all diagrams, a plus symbol. Oh, and when there's a plus, you also use underlining. I will illustrate. So actually, there's only 3 propositions, and we already know that number 3 is the conclusion. Even with that, though, there are 4 possible diagrams of this argument. And I will give you, these are 2 of them. Here's one. You don't have to draw a circle around the conclusion, but I'm going to anyway. So the first thing, so when you're diagramming an argument, first step is to list all the propositions. Then the next step is to identify which of them is the conclusion, and it won't always be the last one. In this case, it is. And then when you've done that, find the space that you've allotted for your diagram, and you write the conclusion number at the bottom. Then you have to put all the other numbers in their place as well. Well, these are the 4 possibilities. What's the difference amongst these 4? Well, there's a key difference between these 2. And the key difference between these 2 is in whether or not the premises are dependent or independent. So, premises can be either dependent or independent. According to what? According to how they support the conclusion. So I'm going to define what a dependent premise is. Oh look, it's written here already. A dependent premise is a premise that needs another premise before it can support usually the conclusion, but not always the conclusion. It might be another premise too. So it is a premise that needs another premise before it can support another proposition. Whether that other proposition be another premise or the ultimate conclusion. Now, what do I mean need another? That definition itself is again a little bit vague. Well, we'll work that out by a process of doing examples. Which, out of A and B, which do you think represents the dependent premises? B. Yes, you can see 1 and 2 are dependent on each other. Why? Well look, here 1 supports 3 by itself. Does it need any help? No. It is strong and independent. It is a rugged individual. Okay? So 1 is an independent premise. 2 is an independent premise. They don't need each other. Here, they're codependent. Right? They cling to each other. They cannot support the conclusion except working as a team. So this is how you indicate dependent premises. 1 and 2 are both dependent on each other, whereas here 1 and 2 are independent premises. Now, let's go through. Here are the 4 possibilities. Here, 1 supports 3 by itself, 2 supports 3 by itself. Here, 1 and 2 working together can support the conclusion. Here, 1 supports 2, and 2 supports the conclusion. Here it's reversed. 2 supports 1, and 1 supports the conclusion. Incidentally, in these 2, you've got an obvious premise, an obvious conclusion, and a sort of middle thing. Why is it a sort of middle thing? Well, it's not the conclusion, because the conclusion is always at the bottom. But why is it conclusion-like?
It can seem to be a conclusion from 1.
Yes, it is supported by 1. So it's, we think of conclusions as the things that are supported. Well here, this is supported by 1. But it's not the overall conclusion. In fact, it's a premise. It is a premise, but it's a type of premise that we call a sub-conclusion. It's not the overall conclusion, that's 3, but it is supported by other premises, like as conclusions are. So we call, in this case, 2 is a sub-conclusion, in this case, 1 is a sub-conclusion. All right. Who thinks, now I want you to decide, on very little information, what is the right diagram for the argument we're considering? Who says it's A? Who says it's B? Who says C or D? One of the others. Okay, so B is the overwhelming winner. Why? Why do you need both of them?
Because each one, like, if you just had one or two by itself, it wouldn't be conclusive, and you should be able to.
Yeah, let's work this through. And here's the way to work this through if you're ever unsure if your diagram is correct. First of all, say the conclusion. So, Lonnie shouldn't go into law. Then you ask the question, what's the evidence? And if your diagram is correct, then going to the top of an arrow that leads to the conclusion, so going to the back end of the arrow, will provide the answer. So if this was the correct diagram, then I ask, so Lonnie shouldn't go into law. What's your evidence? To be a lawyer, you need to be good at keeping track of details. Does that by itself prove that Lonnie shouldn't go into law?
No.
No, the only way it would is if you had background information about Lonnie, but you don't. You are to assume ignorance. So why doesn't that show that Lonnie shouldn't go into law?
It doesn't say anything about Lonnie at all.
It doesn't say anything about Lonnie at all. So, by itself, it's actually totally irrelevant to Lonnie. Okay? So the conclusion connects Lonnie and the law. This doesn't say anything about Lonnie. All right, let's see if this is an independent premise. Lonnie shouldn't go into law. What's your evidence? Well, Lonnie is terrible at keeping track of details. Does that prove that he shouldn't go into law?
No, because it makes no statement.
Doesn't say anything about the law. So what this says something connecting Lonnie and the law. This doesn't mention Lonnie. This doesn't mention the law. So neither of them by themselves are even relevant to the conclusion. They don't even weakly support the conclusion. So these are not independent premises. What kind of premises are they? Dependent, which is why 2 is the correct one. Now, let's see if this works. Lonnie shouldn't go into law. What's your evidence? Well, to be a lawyer, you need to be good at keeping track of details. And incidentally, when you go up an arrow, you should be answering a what's your evidence question. When you go over a plus sign, the question that should be answered is so what? Okay? This is going to be helpful later on when we talk about missing premises. All right. So Lonnie shouldn't go into law. What's your evidence? Well, to be a lawyer, you need to be good at keeping track of details. So what? Is this the answer? Lonnie is terrible at keeping track of details. Yes. So put them together. Lonnie can't keep track of details. To be a lawyer, you need to keep track of details. That does prove that Lonnie shouldn't go into law. Right? Now, we don't have to worry if any of this is true. Maybe it's false that all lawyers have to be good at keeping track of details. They can hire interns to do that. Or all they have to do is to be good at lying with a straight face, right? No, I shouldn't say that. I might need a lawyer. We don't have to worry about that. We're just looking at the logical structure, how the propositions are related. And this is the correct diagram for that one. All right, let's look at number 2. Ethan. And incidentally, every time this happens, it's always a guy that reads this one.
He sat next to me in class today, and the other day he smiled when I ran into him at the library. I think he's interested in me.
A little conceited, I think, Ethan. Okay, what is the conclusion?
I think he's interested in me.
Actually, let's be careful here. If the conclusion was, I think he's interested in me, what kind of evidence would be relevant? Evidence about what?
Your thoughts.
About you, about your state of mind. Because if we're trying to prove what you think, then we need to give evidence about you. But that isn't really what's going on here. What's the real conclusion of saying?
He is interested.
He is interested in me. So in fact, in this case, I think is sort of being used as an indicator word. Why is it that you think? Because of the reasons you've just given. So I think in this case is being used a bit like, it seems that, or on the basis of what I've encountered, it is reasonable to believe that. Okay, so the conclusion is, he's interested in me. Well, who wouldn't be? All right, Now we want to know, once again, I can reuse my say diagrams, which is good because I'm lazy, because 3 is the conclusion. Work out what you think is the correct diagram. Who says A? Who says B? Who says C? Who says D? Now there are a couple for C. Let's look at if we can work that one out. If this is C, then 2 would be supported by 1. So in other words, I would say 2, and I'd say, what's your evidence? And 1 would be the answer. So 2 is, the other day he smiled at me. What's your evidence that the other day he smiled at you? 2, the answer is, he sat next to me in class today. Is that right? Now, him sitting next to you in class is no evidence at all for whether or not he smiled at you. So it's not this one. Who said B? A couple of timid people. Now, it's not B, okay? But I can tell you why you might be tempted to think that. And that is, by themselves, the reasons he smiled at me, he sat next to me, on their own, they're pretty flimsy, aren't they? Because lots of people smile at you, particularly in friendly America, less so in England. But, you know, and lots of people sit next to you, because maybe that's the only seat there is. So by themselves, they seem pretty flimsy, whereas you think, well, but put enough of them together, you know, I turn on my light at night, and there he is outside the window, you know, it starts to add up, right? But in fact, what you've got to think is, don't think about how strong the argument is. Think about whether or not by itself it's remotely relevant. And it is remotely relevant. If he smiled at you, that is remotely relevant to him being interested in you. It's not strong, but we're not interested in strength. We're interested in relevance. Contrast with this. Lonnie is terrible at keeping track of details. It's not even remotely relevant to a career in the law by itself. Okay, whereas this one is relevant at least. All right? So, the correct answer is A. They're independent premises. It's a crappy argument. You're obviously a bit conceited if you believe that, right? Maybe, if, like I said, if it turns out he's a stalker, then we should have believed it. But that is the structure. Does that make sense? Let's look at number 3. Let's just keep doing them. Done.
Molly is a very bright child. She began speaking on her first birthday, whereas most children do not begin to speak until later.
Okay. What number represents the conclusion? 1. Does everyone agree? Yes. So the point of this argument is that Molly is a very bright child. What's the evidence? Well, what's supplied is the evidence. Are the premises given dependent or independent? I want a chorus, please.
Dependent.
I want a chorus, please. 1, 2, okay. There you go. Dependent. Why are they dependent? Well, you can. I mean, you could present them, but...
The point of it proving them.
Yeah, so for example, if I just said, Molly is a very bright child, she began speaking on her first birthday. That doesn't prove it, because for all I know, they come out of the womb talking, right? You know? That's what movies have taught me. Look who's talking too. But it's when you add in the information that most children do not begin to speak until late, and which of course, most children do not begin to speak until after 1, doesn't by itself prove anything about Molly, because it doesn't say anything about Molly. So that can't be an independent one. So basically, the correct diagram would be one like B, only with number 1 at the bottom. Let's skip ahead and give an example involving a sub-conclusion, because we haven't seen any like this yet. Well, look at page 99. Question number 5. It tells you the structure. You just have to fill in the numbers. It's kind of the reverse of what we're doing. So it says, since 1, my car won't start. 2, I will have to take the bus. So 3, I need to take exact change to the fare. First thing we need to know, Kyle, do you have your book? what is the conclusion? Who thinks they know? 3. So number 3 is, I will have to take exact change for the fare. Who agrees? Is that the overall point? Okay, so good. I don't have to change my diagrams. We know that it is one of these. 3 is the conclusion, but either 2 is the direct support for 3 and 1 is support for 2, or the other way around. Which is the correct one? We have a vote for C. Anyone disagree? Well, let's try it out. Remember, if it works, then when you go up an arrow, incidentally, what does an arrow stand for? What's that? No, so what is the question that is answered when you hop across a plus sign. What does an arrow represent?
What's the other?
Not a question, what's that?
Therefore.
Yeah, or supports. An arrow stands for supports. Remember the definition of an argument? The premise supports the conclusion, so that's what's going on here. 1 supports 3 in this case. All right, now you said it was this one. Okay, well in that case, we say 3, which is, I need to take exact change for the fare. And then I ask the question, what's the evidence? And 2 should be the answer. I need to take exact change for the fare. What's your evidence? I will have to take the bus. Yeah. Or, what's your evidence or why, depending on which seems more appropriate. I need to take exact change for the bus. Why? Because I have to take the bus. Duh. All right, I have to take the bus. Why? This should be the answer. My car won't start. Does that work? Yes. So that's the correct structure of that one. All right. That'll do it for today. Do not forget to do your homework. Your homework. What's that?
I said I'm really glad you're reminding us again.
You're not going to forget because you're all going to away and do it right now. Do not leave it until the last minute being 10 p.m. on Tuesday.